Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Geneva. Thank you for joining this press briefing. My name is Tony Consul. I'm the head of communications here at IATA, and I'm joined by our Director General, Willie Walsh. We have a short presentation on sort of latest situation of the industry and a few remarks from Willie, and then we'll throw it open to questions via the chat function. So to get us started, Willie, did you want to take us through a briefing as to what this current state of the industry is?
Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. I have a short presentation, as Tony said, to take you through the most recent traffic data release for October 2021. So if we go to the first slide, thank you. Once again, you can see that air cargo is performing well. In October, it was 9% ahead of October 2019, so a very good performance. And in fact, year to date, to the end of October versus the same period in 2019, it's running at 9% ahead on a yearly basis as well. So cargo continues to perform very well. A lot of that comes from additional freighter activity because, as we've mentioned previously, the belly hold activity is still disrupted as a result of the challenges with international travel, particularly on the wide body long haul, where a lot of restrictions are preventing passenger traffic, but some of those aircraft are operating to carry air cargo. So good performance from the cargo side of the business. If we look at domestic, again, the same sort of trend continues there. In October, down 22%. Year to date, it's down 29% versus the same period in 2019. And international, we're seeing it recover, but it's a slow slog, really. 65% down in October. Year to date, down about 79%. So the challenge there continues to be the problems caused by government restrictions on travel, border closures, testing requirements, which is suppressing the demand. And again, we continue to see evidence that where these restrictions are removed, demand returns pretty quickly. Overall, the industry for October was 49.4% down on where it was in 2019. So I think that's the first time we've moved above the 50% mark, and year to date we're about 61% down. And if you look at the next slide, please, the domestic markets, it continues to be quite a mixed bag there. We've got Russia running at 24% ahead of where it was in 2019, and Australia 81% behind where it was in 2019. The US is at minus 10.5%. Interestingly, one not shown on this is the European domestic markets, which are performing reasonably well at 7.5% below where they were in 2019. And again, this just reinforces what we've been saying, that where people can travel without restriction, there's good underlying demand. And we move on, next slide, which looks at the international performance. This really does highlight the border closures. So best performing part of the network is North America to Central America, down just over 9%. Within Europe, so international across borders within Europe is down 36%. But then you look at the bottom of the chart there, within Asia, 97% down on 2019, and it's completely flatlined. There's no movement on that at all. So the major problem here continues to be the restrictions on cross-border travel, which is suppressing the demand. But we were encouraged by what we were seeing in Europe as travel restrictions started to relax. Clearly, November will show a slightly different picture, and then December, with all of the recent events, will be disrupted again. If I move on just to, so these are the traffic data that we look at. If we look at the schedule data, so looking slightly ahead, you can see that airlines are adding capacity, both in the domestic and international. However, what we have seen recently is some very short-term reductions in capacity following the new travel restrictions that were introduced recently. So, prior to this latest variant, we were seeing greater confidence in the industry, supported by an improving situation with passenger traffic, and we were seeing airlines respond by returning capacity into the market. I think that's the intention of airlines as we go forward. Hopefully this will be a short-term disruption as governments recognise that these restrictions are ineffective, and I'll comment on that in a moment. And the next slide just shows some booking data, which would at this stage indicate that November international travel performance should show a slight improvement on where we were in October, but domestic is likely to show a slight decline. But overall, when we can take restrictions out of the market and allow people to travel, there is good demand there, and certainly improving demand once people get comfortable with the requirements of international travel. And I've one final slide which deals with this issue of travel restrictions. And what we did here is we plotted the travel restrictions on a sort of weighted average basis across all of the regions in the red line there, and the number of infections. And quite honestly, it says here, the impact of travel restrictions on cases is unclear. I would go a bit further than that. I would say there's no correlation between the introduction of these restrictions and the effect that it's having on the transmission of the virus. And again, I would point to the UK. Don't mean to keep picking on them, but they give us plenty of stuff to allow us to pick on them. When they introduced the travel restrictions back on the 22nd of May of 2020, so 18 months ago when they first introduced these restrictions, they said they were doing so to prevent a second wave. At the time of introducing them, on that same day, they had 254,000 infections reported recorded in the UK since the start of the pandemic. So 254,000 on the 22nd of May, and it's 10.6 million today. So, there's no evidence of restrictions suppressing the transmission of the virus. And again, if you go to the data from the UK, as you've heard me quote before, all of the people required to do PCR testing when they arrived in the UK, the positivity rate amongst that group was 0.8%, while at the very same time, the positivity rate in the general population, again, based on the PCR testing, so like for like, was over 8%, 8.3%. So, we're very clear that these measures do not achieve the stated objective. And in fact, we're, I think, supported on this by statements from the WHO and the ECDC. And I'm just going to read some of these comments because I think they are worth reflecting on. And what the WHO is saying, that blanket travel bans will not prevent the international spread, and they place a heavy burden on lives and livelihoods. In addition, they can adversely impact global health efforts during the pandemic by disincentivizing countries to report and share epidemiological and sequencing data. All countries should ensure that the measures are regularly reviewed and updated when new evidence becomes available. And that's the case, supported again by the ECDC, which says pretty much the same thing. The best thing governments can do here is to look and assess the risk based on the data and make decisions based on that. But it's clear to us that the travel industry and airlines in particular are being used as the poster child to transmit fear, to transmit the messages that governments want to force people to continue to restrict their movements, to comply with all of the COVID requirements. It's not because there's a a threat caused by aviation, but it's merely to be able to demonstrate that there is a threat out there, and by hammering the airline industry, they think they're sending a strong, powerful message to the general population to get them to comply with the restrictions. But it's doing huge damage to the airline industry and to tourism industry and global economies, and it's doing huge damage to people who have been unable to travel, to connect with their family, connect with friends, travel for business, and really the time is well past when governments can look at the risk associated with international travel and look at the general risk to the population and start focusing on the areas that need to be focused on, because the risk is definitely not coming from aviation. The risk is in the community, and the sooner governments actually start targeting that and recognizing that we are going to have more of these variants. I'm not a scientist, but every scientist I've listened to explains that this is the natural development of a virus. We are going to have more of them. We can't keep shutting down aviation and shutting down economies, when in reality it's not providing any measures to restrict the transmission of the virus, and more importantly, it's doing huge damage to the industry. So I'll pause at that and hand back to Tony when we can take your questions.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. We've got actually quite a few questions in the queue. And I guess the first area that people are asking about is, do we have any assessment of the impact of these new measures that governments have introduced in respect of Omicron?
Not at this stage. I think it's still too early. Anecdotally, it is impacting on passenger traffic. The restrictions and the new testing is having creating a lot of confusion in the market. I travelled myself from Dublin to Switzerland yesterday. The flight had not many people on board, but a lot of people who turned up for the flight couldn't get on because they hadn't done a PCR test in Ireland, which is now the requirement that the Swiss authorities have introduced. I've heard similar stories in other parts of the world where these new requirements for testing have been introduced at short notice. People haven't been able to comply with them or haven't understood that the rules have changed, and it's causing great confusion. And I think that is causing a suppression of demand, because once people experience that confusion, turn up at an airport to take a flight that they believe they've met all the requirements to get on board, and then are told, sorry, you should have done a PCR test instead of a rapid antigen test. And I'll be honest, the only reason I was able to get on the flight is I didn't know what was going to happen, so I took a PCR test when I arrived in Dublin, so I'd done one. Had I not done that, I wouldn't have been able to get a PCR in time to take the return flight. So anecdotally, it's clearly having an impact on traffic. I think all of us are optimistic that governments will quickly review these restrictions and recognise, based on the information that's available to us now, that the risk is no more significant than it was before this variant was identified, and the restrictions hopefully will be removed. And that's the critical message. Governments are quick to put these restrictions in place. They believe they're doing it for the right reason, or at least they argue they're doing it for the right reason. But when that reason is gone or no longer valid, then they should remove the restriction. Unfortunately, we've seen them very slow to do so, and I think it's time now that governments are honest with people. If they do introduce restrictions, they should be introduced for the right reason, and when that reason is addressed, they should be removed.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question about the EU. I suppose it would be the EU travel pass, or the green pass. And the question is asking about the recognition of booster vaccinations in the in these sort of traveler credentials. And I guess maybe we can answer it in two ways. One would be, first, is it a priority to get them recognized? And secondly, I suppose, how does the IATA travel pass deal with that?
Yeah, well, the IATA travel pass can deal with that. We're going live with a number of airlines now, as we had seen international travel begin to pick up. And as I had mentioned previously, the IATA travel pass will be critical once international passenger numbers start increasing, because that will put significant pressure on airports. So working with some of our partner airlines, we've been able to adapt to changing requirements and to test how quickly we can introduce any of these new requirements. So the team are confident that they can deal with any of these changes in a very quick way. I think getting recognition of these boosters is important. We had seen great progress, and we give credit to the EU for the development of the EU DCC, which was not only adopted by the 27 EU countries, but by a further 23, 24 other countries. So, we have a system that works, and it has been, well adopted. We would encourage more governments to look at either mutual recognition or to adopt the EU system, which, as I say, is quite simple and very effective. But once the requirements changed, the systems can be changed reasonably quickly, and certainly the IATA travel pass can be adopted and adapted to address any of these changes.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a question about testing requirements. And I know you've spoken a lot about the cost of PCR testing. The questioner is asking, how much does the cost of testing add to a trip? And to what extent is that a disincentive for people to travel?
Well, it's a huge disincentive, and of course it depends on the price you're paying. But we've seen previously when we did a review of this, dealing with 16 countries, the cost ranging from $0 in France at the time to $278 in Tokyo for the same test, and we're seeing that wide range of costs across the network today. And what is terrible for consumers is there's clear evidence that they're being ripped off here. Very, very clear. Again, I'll pick on the UK because the UK government publishes a long list of suppliers who will provide the test. They advertise prices starting at around £1. You haven't a hope in hell of finding one for that price. It does need to be regulated, and it needs to be controlled. And particularly when you have these restrictions now where the test is required to release you from quarantine in the UK, for example. We can't tolerate a situation as had existed where tests were arriving late, results were being sent on time. So I think governments need to be fair to their citizens and to consumers around the world. They should not allow this industry to rip off people in the way they have, given that the requirement that they've introduced is based on public health guidelines. And that being the case, then we strongly believe that they should follow WHO guidelines and provide the testing free of charge. If not, to do it at a nominal charge that covers the actual cost of the test, which is nowhere close to what some people are being charged for tests, across the world. So this is an area, if these testing requirements are to remain in place, that needs to be regulated, and competition authorities should have already addressed this and use their powers to protect consumers who are being forced to undertake expensive tests, poor quality of service, and in some cases not even getting the tests that they have paid for.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Asia. The questioner notes that you said that intra-Asia travel was basically flatlining, and they're asking, what is that related to? Is that primarily the effect of China and India having restrictions, or is it more broad than that?
Yeah, it's more broad than that. There are quite a number of countries in Asia who have travel restrictions, and it is impacting significantly on both domestic, markets, intra-Asia markets, and Asia to other parts of the world. I was just looking, so from Asia to, let me check here where we have Asia to North America. for example, it's down 91%. Year to date, it's down 89%. So it principally relates to the border closures in Asia. And we've seen, similar figures for other markets. So it's not just down to one or two countries. It's down to quite a number of countries in the region who have had border closures or significant restrictions on people traveling there. As I said, it's completely flatlined. We've seen no movement. Within Asia, travel of down almost 98% is an indication of the full suppression of demand, because there's no doubt that if those restrictions were removed, there would be a lot of demand in that region.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about onboard transmission. And the questioner says, is there a need to update studies on onboard transmission given the emergence of the new variants and the industry's reliance on these sort of dated studies or studies that have at least predate some of the variants that have emerged?
Yeah, well, the first thing I say is there going to be variants all the time. So, I don't think we should become fixated on the outbreak of this variant. What scientists tell us, and I've certainly spoken to a lot of them in recent weeks, is that, viruses mutate. In fact, that was what they were saying to us when this virus first appeared, and that generally, the virus tries to stay alive and it mutates to do so. And if it follows the natural evolution of a virus, it does become sort of more infectious, more transmissible, but less of an impact on the host. And I'll go back. I was just looking earlier, actually, to a report by Reuters on the 25th of September of this year, so not that long ago, and it quoted Patrick Key, I think it was, of IATA, who said that there were only 7 passengers out of 3 million on flights in recent weeks which showed symptoms of the virus. Risks are highly controlled and very marginal. And I think that's still the case. There were a lot of studies done into the transmission on board the aircraft, and for several reasons, it's well recognized that the risk on board the aircraft is actually significantly lower than in most other places where you'll find people, down to the fact that the air is filtered. With very effective HEPA filters, the airflow is vertical rather than horizontal, and the air is fully refreshed every 2 to 3 minutes. So we're not concerned about what happens on board the aircraft, and that's something that has been tested, and I'm sure will continue to be tested. But I don't believe that the evidence and the data that we've seen before this variant is going to change that.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. We have a question asking about the impact of the reaction to Omicron. And the question basically is asking, do you think this could cause airlines to ask governments for more state aid? Are they going to be able to survive this without going bankrupt, et cetera? So how concerned are you about the financial state of the industry?
Well, I think where governments impose restrictions and prevent airlines from flying, so actually stop them from operating, as we're seeing here. In fact, I've got to give great credit to airline management teams dealing with this in recent weeks, continuing to transport people, despite the fact that in a lot of cases the demand has significantly reduced because people have cancelled their flights because of these new restrictions, fear of having to quarantine. Now, in most cases, those quarantine requirements have been removed. So, for example, Switzerland had introduced 10-day quarantine for a list of over 30 countries. I think to their credit, they recognized that was going too far and removed the quarantine requirement after a few days. They still have what I think are, requirements for testing that go way beyond what is necessary. So I think where governments impose these restrictions and say they're doing so in the interests of public health, well, then airlines are justified in looking to governments to provide support in the same way as governments are supporting other sectors of the economy when they're forced to close. So there's been no specific support in many cases for aviation. Some countries have been very good, recognizing the critical economic and long-term strategic importance of their industry, but others have not. But I think where these restrictions prevent people from operating, then it's perfectly justifiable to go and look for financial support. I still am optimistic that this will be a short-term issue because it's clear to everybody the evidence that's becoming available to us is more positive than maybe people had believed. And let's be honest, the scare was because of the knee-jerk reaction of governments who, took action based on no evidence. In fact, they just ignored the evidence and decided to impose these restrictions without understanding whether it would have any positive impact. And it's clear from all of the data, they don't have positive impact. Closing your borders after the virus is inside your country is not going to achieve anything. And that's what the science is telling us. So we'll watch this carefully, but I think we have to push back, challenge governments as to why these restrictions are introduced, and challenge them on the basis of data and science, not on the basis of anecdote or on the basis of fear, but on the basis of, prove to us that this is going to make a difference. Because all of the evidence we have, and there's a lot of it available now, shows that these measures have not been effective. In fact, have not done anything to suppress the transmission of the virus because the virus was in the country.
Okay. Just on that, Willie, we have a question referencing back to your comment that the risk is not in aviation, it's in the community. And the questioner says, but the spreading of Omicron must have started somewhere. There were 14 cases on 2 recent KLM flights 2 weeks ago. How can you exclude aviation from being a risk?
Well, it's not just aviation then, so let's stop people traveling by car, by bus, by train, by boat. Let's stop people walking, cycling, moving. Let's lock everybody in their houses if that's what you want, because these variants can appear anywhere. And that's the reality. We will have more variants. We don't know where they're going to appear. And as the WHO says, don't penalize the countries that find them, which is what is happening. So South Africa has been hammered economically because they have the benefit of being able to test and sequence. So, we have to learn to live with this virus. That's what the scientists are telling us. Take sensible measures. They take effective measures, which, principally revolve around the vaccinations, which again appear to be effective against this variant. So what we need is for more of the world to be vaccinated. The idea that I think Africa is still only around 7.5%, fully vaccinated. We need to be doing more to get more people vaccinated. That's what's going to give us the greatest benefit. So the idea that somehow you won't have variants if there's no flights is complete nonsense. You're going to get variants, and they're going to transmit in the community. And the idea that if you shut down your country, that the virus will disappear, it's not. The virus is still there. The virus is looking for opportunities to mutate and find a new host, and that's what's going to happen. So we can't shut down everything when a new variant appears. We're going to have to continue to encourage the development of the science, development of antiviral drugs, which I believe will represent another very positive benefit to the global population, and continue to support one another when it comes to vaccinations.
Okay, thank you. We have a question looking towards the year end, and the questioner asks whether the travel restrictions that have been put in place for Omicron will impact the Christmas holiday season, or do you think it will be over before then and people will be confident enough to travel? And a second part of that is, if not, then how long do you expect the paralysis to continue?
Well, I'd like to think, again, based on all of the data that's available to the governments and decision makers, that these restrictions will be removed and people will be able to get back to their travel plans as they had intended to do. It's too early to say whether it's going to impact on the traditional holiday travel plans, but there are still people flying. And there are lots of people who are very comfortable to fly. And maybe I would go back and suggest that the arguments that we made early on in this, whereas where the role of government is to provide data, to provide information, and to allow individuals to make their decisions based on their own risk appetite. As I said, I've had no hesitation in flying. I look at all of the data, like many of you. I probably looked at more data points than a lot of people, but based on the data that's available to me and listening to the experts in this area, I'm comfortable taking a decision that I will continue to travel, and that's what I intend to do. And I think the same would be true of a lot of people if they were allowed the freedom to make that decision. In the same way as we're allowed freedom to make other decisions that impact on our health. I don't want to live in a world where government's going to make all of my health-based decisions. So I've had 2 PCRs, 2 lateral flow tests, and 3 pints of Guinness in the last 7 days. I prefer to be able to continue to drink the Guinness and drop taking the PCR test. But it's I'm sure Guinness is good for you. That's what they will say. But we take decisions ourselves. Some people still smoke. People still drink. People are eating too much. But that's their personal decision, and we should be allowed, based on the data, based on proper evidence-based information, make decisions as to what it is we want to do.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a question asking about our friends in the industry, the airports. And the questioner says that airports too are bleeding. Is IATA concerned that this could affect business for the airlines?
Not at all. No. A bleeding airport is music to my ears because, quite honestly, okay, maybe I'm being unfair. There are some good airports out there, but the behavior of airports, principally the ones we've called out, and it's not just Heathrow, but they continue to shock everybody with their demand for a 90% increase in airport charges at a time when the industry is trying to get back on their feet. We've got Amsterdam, we've got airports in India, we've got airports in South Africa, all of them looking to ramp up their costs, believing that that's going to be helpful to the industry. It clearly isn't. So I have sympathy for some of the smaller regional airports where there is genuine competition. But for most of these big quasi-monopoly or monopoly airports, I don't have sympathy for them. Airlines have had to take very drastic measures to ensure that they have survived. Airlines have pretty much all gone to their shareholders to look for additional support. I think there's a lot that airports could do, rather than going to their customers. I think many of these airports that have looked to raise increases should go to their shareholders to look for support rather than trying to impose these massive increases on the airline industry.
Okay, thank you. Willie, earlier you mentioned vaccinations. We have a question that follows up on that by asking what our position is on making vaccinations mandatory for airline industry employees or for passengers.
No, we've not come to a position on mandatory vaccination. What we do believe is that airline employees should be prioritized for vaccination, and other transport workers. In fact, we met with the WHO and the ILO, a group representing the trucking industry, the shipping industry, and the trade union movement. So airlines, truckers, shippers, shipping, to argue that airline employees should be free to go about their work without these very restrictive measures that some countries have introduced. And given that these workers have to cross borders, they should be prioritized when it comes to the distribution of vaccines. But at this point, where governments mandate vaccines, that's fine. But we've not taken a view that the industry should mandate vaccines for our employees or our customers, and that's principally because many of our customers, and indeed many of our employees around the world, can't get access to vaccines. So, mandating something that isn't available is definitely not the right way forward.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a follow-up question on airport charges with specific reference to Poland, which has announced some hefty proposals to hike fees, and they're asking whether that will impact ticket prices, how that will impact perhaps the overall recovery of demand in the local market.
Yeah, so anybody who listens to an airport and is conned by the idea that airport charges are insignificant, you really needs to look at the nature of this industry. If our costs increase, if airport charges go up, ultimately the consumer is going to have to pay for that, because airlines are not in a position to absorb those costs, particularly in the environment we're operating in at the moment. In the best decade of this industry's history, which was up in 2010 to 2019, the operating margin for the industry, from memory, was 5.5% in that decade. And that was the best we had done. In the previous decade, I think it was 0.7%. So, we have to keep costs under control. And airports are far too quick to say, we're only a little part of the ticket price. That's not true. They're a significant part. Every cost is a significant part, and every cent that they add to their airport charges, adds to the cost base of the airline, and ultimately will add to the price of tickets. And that will get to a point where it will suppress demand, because a lot of people who travel are very price sensitive. And Poland in particular, the market there, it consists of a very big element of price-sensitive travelers. So, if the Polish airports start increasing prices, it will ultimately see its way through into ticket prices, and that's likely to suppress demand for travel in Poland.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We've been talking a lot about specific travel restrictions, but we have a question that's talking about other measures that governments implement in society. For example, requirement to work from home. Do you think that those types of measures also reduce the appetite for travel?
No, in fact, we've some evidence to suggest that those other measures are increasing the appetite to travel, because people have more flexibility in how they work, and therefore have more freedom to travel. And that's something that we've done a bit of research on, and the propensity to travel in that environment is likely to increase. We've also seen evidence where in a lot of countries, people have saved money through this period, and some of it is because they have not been able to spend their money, but there is pent-up demand. So I'm not concerned about other policies, particularly things like flexible working, where actually I think flexible working will represent an opportunity for the airline industry once we can facilitate travel without all of these restrictions.
Okay. We have a questioner who's, I guess, reflecting on the fact that we're calling on governments to coordinate, we're calling on governments to follow what the WHO is doing. But aside from that, what can the industry do to try and affect change in the way that the system works? Is there a possibility they're suggesting to work with WHO to have a prevention mechanism, or something a bit more forceful than just advice?
Yeah, it's a great question, and clearly we would like to work with the WHO. As I said, we had a very good dialogue with the WHO, and we will continue to engage with them. And I think there are opportunities for us to work together and to support one another. I know that many of the things we have said they would agree with, because we've argued for a risk-based approach to travel and to restrictions. I think it's easier for me to say that maybe than it is for WHO, but and principally because in the airline industry we deal with risk all the time. That's the nature of our business. We're comfortable assessing risk. We're good at assessing risk. We're good at identifying mitigating actions to reduce the net risk, and we do that all the time. And we're also good at being held accountable, because that's the nature of our business as well. Politics tends to be different, where politicians don't feel comfortable dealing with risk, don't like being held accountable, don't like being challenged. So we would like to work with governments and health agencies. And let's be honest, we have to learn from this experience. The idea that the world does not learn from what we've gone through over the past 22 months, I think that's just completely unacceptable. We must learn, and we must do better next time round. And there have been a lot of positives out of this. The development of a vaccine in such a short period of time has been a real positive. But understanding that that vaccine needs to be distributed right across the world, that message still hasn't landed sufficiently well to see the rates of vaccination more equitable across the world. It's not good enough that we can vaccinate some countries and leave other countries completely unvaccinated. So we have to deal with a global problem through global cooperation and global methods. And we need to see greater cooperation between governments. We need to see people listen to the health experts. That's what the WHO is there for. They've done a fantastic job in previous epidemics, and had we listened to their advice and acted on their advice, I've no doubt that the situation we face today would be an awful lot better. So we want to work with others, and we're prepared to work with others. But where we see bad behaviour and where we see governments taking steps that are not justified and not supported by the data, then we will continue to call them out.
Okay. Thanks, Willie. We have a question about consumer reaction. So when the Delta variant appeared, there was an almost immediate impact on forward bookings. It's a bit early still to tell if that's the case with Omicron, but would you expect that passengers are getting more accustomed to these types of announcements and more used to maybe less knee-jerk in their reaction, or do you think they're reacting in the same way as governments very quickly?
That's a great question, and my strong belief is that consumers are getting used to it much more quickly than governments are. What consumers are disrupted by the knee-jerk reactions of governments, not news of the variants. We've all become experts in variants and viruses. We've all known that there would be new variants discovered. We've all waited for them, and we're just waiting for what they're going to call it. But I think the consumer is much more savvy than maybe governments give them credit for. And that's why I say, go back to a situation whereby governments give us the information, governments provide us with the data, governments provide us with help to make an informed decision, and that we then as individuals, based on our own risk appetite, can take a decision as to what it is we want to do. And some people will decide they don't want to travel, and others will decide that they do. And I believe that that's what should be allowed.
Okay, we have a question about sort of expectation on travel restrictions in the EU. Do you think things will get better from now and governments will start to review, or do you expect that we'll see more restrictions coming in place as we've seen in some other countries like the UK, for example?
Well, I think governments will have to justify why they're not reviewing, because you take a decision based on no data, which is in effect what some of these governments said. We don't know what we're dealing with. We're going to shut the borders. Data then becomes available. Now you know what you're dealing with, so you no longer can justify the knee-jerk reaction that you took when news of this first came out. You need to assess it based on the data you have and the risk associated with it, and that's what we would and should demand of governments, that they review these restrictions and remove them. Why should we tolerate having our lives restricted when there's no reason for those restrictions to be in place. So when the evidence says that the need for restriction is gone, the restriction should be removed.
Okay, thank you. We have a question referencing back to some comments you made about domestic markets. You suggested that in November there would be a downturn in domestic markets. Is that primarily changes in domestic China market in response to various virus outbreaks, or do you see a more broad issue in domestic markets?
It's in relation to a couple of domestic markets. So Japan, where the Japanese domestic market had been recovering. I can find it here. We were, so year to date, Japan was at -62, whereas in October was -49. So you can see the Japanese market had been picking up, but I think we're likely to see some restrictions there potentially in China. That it's too early to say, but I think that's likely to be the case, that in some of the countries where we had seen steady domestic traffic or growing domestic traffic, I think that may just take a little bit of a hit. But Russia continues to be very strong. I suspect prior to this variant, we would have seen improving domestic figures out of Australia, and I fully expect to see that again. I think the situation in Australia is likely to be temporary, so there'll be swings and roundabouts, but it's just based on a quick snapshot of the data that we have. I don't think it tells us too much at this point.
Okay. We have a question about some of the announcements that governments have made about on-arrival testing. So in some cases where that testing is being proposed potentially for the airport location, does IATA have any concerns about that? Are we working with others to try and find alternatives so that we don't have crowding around these choke points in airports for on-arrival testing, or presumably also document checks?
Yeah, I think airports aren't built, aren't designed to cope with this, and we need to be very careful. If there's genuine concern about transmission because people are close to one another, all you have to do is look at the images of some of these airports where people are piled up on top of one another as they wait to get their documents checked. So I think we need to be realistic. Most airports would not be capable of dealing with high volumes of on-arrival testing. Many airports today do have testing facilities on site or nearby, and that's good for consumers to have that option. But there isn't sufficient capacity there to deal with everybody who's arriving, and that's just going to create new bottlenecks in the system that clearly would increase risk rather than reduce risk.
Okay. We have a specific question on the UK. And the questioner says the initial response by the UK government was somewhat measured and then explicitly ruled out requiring pre-departure tests. Now they seem to be doing an about turn. What do you think is behind the government's change, the questioner says, even with the opposition of its own MPs?
Yeah, I'm surprised to say somewhat measured. I wouldn't have described the UK action as being somewhat measured. They were the first to sort of get out there and start banning people, reintroducing the red list. The UK, quite honestly, I've given up trying to understand what they do. The traffic light system where you have 6 different lights on the traffic light. Everything they've done has been ridiculed, and I don't think they were measured in their response. They have reintroduced the requirement to do on day 2 or day 2 PCR tests for people who are vaccinated, and now you are required to quarantine until you get the result of that. So that to me is not necessarily a measured response, and then the pre-departure check as well. I don't, and I can't explain why they do these, because it isn't supported by the data. As I said, go back and just look at the data yourself for the UK. I suppose the benefit there is we do have a lot of data. But the positivity rate for people flying into the country, 0.8%. With all of these restrictions, expensive PCR testing, 9.6 million PCR tests done by people flying into the country, positivity rate of 0.8, while at the very same time, same period, same test, PCR testing, positivity rate in the general community over 8%, 8.3, 8.4%. So, I repeat what I say, based on all of the data available in the UK, these measures are excessive, and I'd like to think they will be reviewed and removed as quickly as possible.
Okay, we've been talking a lot about the passenger business. We have a question that's more looking towards the cargo area. And there's been a lot of news recently on inflation, supply chain disruption, etc. Given that at least half of the cargo that's transported by air goes in the belly of passenger aircraft, what do you think the impact of these new travel restrictions or the approach to Omicron will have on the supply chain issues that the world is facing?
Yeah, they're certainly not going to improve them. So maybe just to explain, so traditionally we'll say it's about 50-50, 50% in belly hold, 50% in freighters. That has switched. We're probably at about 60-40 now, 60% in freighters, 40% in belly hold. And the reason costs have gone up, in many cases, the belly hold capacity is being provided by passenger aircraft with no passengers. So traditionally, what airlines often looked to was what the incremental cost of carrying the cargo was, given that most of the cost was borne by the fact that they were transporting passengers, and then the freight was incremental, and principally it was incremental weight. So there was often a case of you just looked at the incremental cost of the fuel. Now you have a situation where some of this belly hold capacity is on passenger aircraft, but there are no passengers. So now all of the fuel must be paid for by the cargo, all of the landing fees, the en route charges. So it's a completely different dynamic. And while some freight rates or cargo rates have increased, so have the costs associated with shipping cargo. So once you get disruption to long-haul international travel, you're likely to see less belly hold capacity being made available. I think airlines, as I say, deserve great credit for actually continuing to support global supply chains by pivoting their business to carry cargo on board their passenger aircraft, and in some cases, you've seen passenger aircraft reconfigured to enable airlines to carry some cargo in the passenger cabin of the aircraft, removing the seats and being able to transport certain types of products. So it's a very challenging environment at the moment, and the restrictions on international cross-border traffic is certainly going to add to the challenge that we've seen in terms of the supply chain, and I think that's something that governments need to appreciate. Plus, going back to what I said earlier, restrictions on crew crossing borders. You've seen some of the stories about crew having to be forced into isolation has created problems there as well. So definite challenge in the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. As we're coming close to the top of the hour, we've got a few more questions. We'll take a couple more, maybe one's looking more towards the future. So one questioner asks if the current restrictions will put off the long-term prognosis for the industry recovery perhaps beyond 2024, or do you think this is a short-term blip?
No, I still think this is short term. I don't think it's going to impact on the longer term forecast that we have looked at.
Okay, and then maybe this will be the last question, which is saying at the end of a second very challenging year of the pandemic, what are your hopes for 2022?
Well, I hope that we see a more coordinated approach from governments. I hope that we see decisions based on data, based on science, based on fact, rather than politics. I hope we see greater cooperation to enable people to get back and be able to travel, be able to take sensible decisions as to whether they want to travel or not. And I hope governments and competition regulators step in and stop consumers being ripped off by these excessive prices for testing. I think it's been a disgrace that governments have actually allowed that to happen, and in some cases effectively promoted it, all in the name of protecting health. So I think that's something that we do really need to look into and understand how that was allowed to happen and where has all the money gone. So, let's just hope that we learn from all the mistakes that were made. We learn from all the good things that were done, and we continue to pay homage to the scientists who have developed vaccines and hopefully will develop new drugs to assist in the treatment of people who catch these viruses, and hopefully, new drugs that will help people, to avoid catching these viruses. So let's all look to a better 2022 than we've had in 2021.
Great. Thanks very much, Willie. I think with that, we'll close this briefing. So thank you to everyone for their participation. This will probably be the last briefing for 2021. So a big thank you to everyone for following us through this year. It's been certainly an eventful one. We will continue to be as open as we can in 2022 with the media to make sure that you understand how IATA is approaching these issues. And I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the new year. Willie, did you have any closing comments?
No, just to thank you all again for joining us, and look forward to talking to you at some stage early in 2022. Thank you.